Joe Biden is incredibly unpopular, and this comes as news to all of the people who still like him. There's a new poll out which show prior to the midterms his approval rating has dropped to 38% in a USA Today and Suffolk poll. That's pretty abysmal at this stage in your presidency. More Americans don't want him to run again in 2024 than want him to run again. I was about to say the only problem the Democrats have here, but it's not the only problem, but it's a significant problem, is that more Americans dislike Kamala Harris. So I think her approval rating is about 28%, which is, again, that's astonishing. This is the supposedly anointed successor, slash milkmaid, slash nurse, slash euthanasia practitioner, if needs be. The person who's supposed to replace Joe Biden.
Kind of Harold Shipman nurse.
She has the laugh. She has the laugh of a psychopathic nurse. But ostensibly, she's put in. Normally, what happens in the cases of very old presidents like this is he put in a vice presidential candidate in order to sort of butter them up in the public's imagination. Make it so even though they've achieved nothing in their lives before, give them some token kind of good sounding role, and then they can claim that they've got foreign policy experience, they can claim they've done this, that and the other, even though the vice president has no power. The problem is that everything they've given to Kamala Harris has been terrible. I mean, she's been terrible at it. They've also given her some really, really nasty things. So they put her in charge of immigration reform, which, okay, that's a really important thing in America, and if you get it right, you'll do incredibly well. But we already knew what Kamala Harris's views on immigration were, and so we knew she was never going to solve the problem. And so she does things like not go to the southern border. And then when asked why she hasn't been to the southern border, lies and says that she has. And when they point out that she hasn't been and Joe Biden hasn't been, she says, yeah, well, Joe Biden did go in 2008. It's just terrible. But no, these figures are just astonishing. So it's a year before the 2022 midterms. Republicans have a clear lead. This is from USA Today. They have a clear lead on the congressional ballot as Joe Biden's approval rating sinks to a new low of 38%. Annoyingly, there they are. So they obviously break this down. So do you approve or disapprove of the job Joe Biden has done as president? 59% of people disapprove, and 37.8% say that they approve. Do you approve or disapprove of the job Kamala Harris has done as vice president? 51% disapprove there, 27% approve. Most people, well, there's a larger number of don't knows. Almost a quarter of Americans, 21%, don't know if Kamala Harris is doing a good job or not.
Don't know.
Again, that sort of largely reflects that, well, she did go missing for a long period of time. Like, she was supposed to, after Joe Biden's, catastrophe in Afghanistan, she was supposed to go on a tour of Southeast Asia to reassure allies that Americans wouldn't just ditch them if the moment came, or if Joe Biden forgot that they existed. But then she didn't turn up, and nobody heard from her for a few days, and then her press office put out this thing saying she'd suffered an anomalous health incident, which is...
An anomalous health what?
An anomalous health incident.
An incident?
No, incident as in incidental.
Yes. Well, yes. It's not like I wouldn't describe a cold as an incident. So what, has she been hammered on the head or something?
Well, who knows? I mean, sometimes with Kamala Harris, you think that is the thing, but it's difficult because on the one hand, it's just cliche, bog standard press office speak, because these people don't speak in functional English anymore. So
maybe
they could just be calling.
Maybe she laughed too hard and gave herself a hernia.
That's possible. But so it could just be that this is press officer speak for she had a cold. But also, we have to remember that for a large part of the last presidential campaign, the media were not covering the fact that Hillary Clinton was clearly very unwell and collapsing when trying to walk downstairs. And it only came out about 2 months after we saw her do this that, oh no, she's been suffering from pneumonia the whole time. Which is the kind of thing you'd think the electorate should know. But the press at that time, being effectively the sort of militant wing of the Democratic Party, didn't deign to tell anyone about this. There is past for this kind of thing as well. Woodrow Wilson suffered a really debilitating stroke, which left him basically a vegetable in the last few months of his presidency. And they just didn't tell anyone. No one knew. They just said that all his office did was put out statements on his behalf and no one saw him. And then they got all the way through to the next election. But it turns out that the guy who was leading the country was actually a vegetable that entire time. Which now, unfortunately, we have the same thing, but much more publicly.
Yeah, there's something actually quite genuinely sad to me at least, about the spectacle of these people like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, putting themselves through this for what to everyone but them is very nakedly a desire for power. And there's something quite sad about that because at the end of the day, however contemptible people may or may not find them, they are human beings, and whatever their flaws as human beings, they have families and desires and
Are
fears
we
and all the rest of
sure?
it.
Are we sure this is the case with Hillary Clinton? It's not
Well,
immediately obvious to people.
well, it's not immediately obvious to me that Mark Zuckerberg isn't a
Oh
robot,
no,
but
Mark Zuckerberg
no,
obviously is a robot. I mean, that's
Hillary Clinton's old school. I mean, if she is a robot, she's running a very primitive operating system. Um, no, but
that's the
there
real
is
Russian hack, was just Hillary Clinton.
what I mean to say is that these people are so and have been for basically their entire adult lives so totally enmeshed in this long game, this house of cards, dare I say, um, in one place, namely Westminster, for one thing, namely the presidency, that they sort of chip away at their souls for decades. And it comes to, the spectacle of Hillary Clinton sort of collapsing, which it wasn't all that well concealed. It was pretty obvious to people who wanted to see it. To me, yeah, there's just something sad about that. Human beings putting themselves through that for the sake of one thing, and it's so naked as well.
It is.
Does anyone really believe that they're doing it for the good of the country? Of course not. They want their names to go down in history.
And you think, I mean, that probably is the last abiding thought that entered Joe Biden's head before all thoughts disappeared. With Hillary Clinton, though, at least she had some volition, whereas one gets the impression with Joe Biden now that he's been shoved there, not even really by his own volition, just because why not? He was vice president. He could recall the magic of the Obama. Well, he couldn't personally recall it, but the Americans could recall the magic of the Obama era. But he doesn't seem really to be in control of his own destiny anymore. It hasn't been for quite some considerable time. With Hillary Clinton, it was different because she was so obviously in control, but maniacally, almost psychopathically so.
Yeah, well, she was compos mentis, and I'm not saying this just to get clicks or whatever, but Joe Biden clearly isn't. He's really not all there.
No.
And so I think there are probably moments where he sort of where he catches up with the present and realizes that he's achieved his lifelong dream and grins about it and asks for some ice cream.
Yeah.
But then he probably sort of just descends back into his, glossy-eyed senescence and wonders what he's doing.
It's such an undeserved dream, though. I mean, this guy is in no way, has never been in any way qualified for this office. He's always been, when he was actually all there, when he was compos mentis, he was still, in different ways, equally bad. He was famously gaffe prone. He was famously not very bright. He was famously...
Well, Thomas Sowell called him just a straight-up idiot, I think.
Well, he is. I mean, given that, his time in the Senate goes back to about the year 1850. But as far back as the 1970s, he was instrumental in the 2008 financial crash. It was Joe Biden's policies that the Fed was following and that the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac particularly were following in terms of subprime mortgages. That was a Joe Biden era policy. He led the digital lynch mob, as it was called, against Clarence Thomas. He ran for president the first time in, it was the 80s, I think it was, and he plagiarised the speech from Neil Kinnock, who is not known in Britain as the most successful leader of a party of all time. He plagiarised that speech and claimed that he was, the son of mine workers and all the rest of that. And it was word for word lifted. The only differences were that he actually exaggerated some of the claims that Kinnock made. So he was not only like the first in his generation to go to university, he was the first in his family to go to university, though this wasn't true. He graduated top of his class, he said, though he didn't. He graduated near the bottom. He inflated numbers and all the rest of it. Then you get to 2008 and he's running against Obama and he says something like, it was almost exact words. Barack is the first clean, articulate black man we've ever had running for president, which is not good, really. He does this.
That just makes me think that Obama must have secretly hated him.
Well, I think it was sort of your classic. What do you want to do as a fairly improbable president, which Barack Obama sort of was. I mean, first-term senator with a not very distinguished record in Chicago, being elevated to the highest office of the land, but with real prospects of running again. If you have real prospects of running again, you don't want as your vice president someone who could theoretically challenge you if things go a little bit wrong. And so you can see the argument from the Obama administration that actually it helps them. It helps them with the South because Biden, he calls himself working class Joe. No one else calls him that. But he has a little bit more of a reputation as a kind of a, tell it as it is, slightly southern, slightly more gritty, normal human being than Barack Obama, who was A, black and therefore unusual in democratic electoral politics, at least at this high level, and B, very clearly highly intelligent and highly educated, and Americans, parts of America at least, distrust both those characteristics. So you can see like the argument for having him there as a non-threat in the way that Hillary Clinton, would not have been, because she would always have been angling to get this new job herself. But the problem with going now for a guy who was already incompetent, even when he was all there, and is now not all there and is even more incompetent, is you get results like this, unfortunately. I mean, more of these figures from USA Today. Nearly half of those surveyed say he's done a worse job as president than they expected. 16% of people who voted for him said he's done a worse job than they expected. And the real bad thing, because independent voters tend to sway close elections in particular, is that by a 7-1 margin, independents also say he's done worse than they expected. And 2/3 of Americans, 64%, say they don't want him to run for a second term in 2024, including 28% of Democrats. So more than a quarter of his own party wants him out. It's not good. And then Kamala Harris's approval rating being 28% is also not good for the Democrats, but good for the rest of the world.
Well, in that sense, it's like Labour had Jeremy Corbyn won, because everyone knows, you mentioned Kamala Harris, everyone knows that when Corbyn shuffled off, and this is what happened, you got someone like Keir Starmer to step in, who is also polling catastrophically badly.
Well, the funny thing with Keir Starmer is that he has taken 2 weeks out, is it now, because he came down with coronavirus, and during his 2 weeks of not being in the spotlight, Labour's polling has improved, which doesn't really speak well for his own popularity.
Well,
but
it speaks to Lord Salisbury's observation that the best politics is to do nothing.
Either that, or it just says if you're an incredibly unlikable person, stay out of the line. But with Ed Miliband, I remember one of his shadow cabinet ministers actually said on television or on radio, I think it was on television though, they actually said at one point, I don't think showing people more of Ed is the best way to win the election. He said of his own party leader, which is not good. Anyway, I mean, to give the slight devil's advocate argument, some of Biden's supporters will say that his popularity will bounce back when the infrastructure bill is signed. The infrastructure bill is broadly supported. That's the $1.2 trillion one, and it's also bipartisan measure. A lot of Republicans think the same thing, but he wants to go further with the Build Back Better agenda, and only 1 in 4 say that bill will help them. So if he's making that the plank of his re-election bid, if he does go for re-election, rather than the infrastructure bill, again, he's not helping himself at all.